It was a calm, regular evening at a well-known upscale restaurant in the heart of the city. The kind of place where conversations flow quietly over the clinking of glasses and diners enjoy the finer things in life. But no one in that restaurant could have predicted how the night would unfold. Among the neatly dressed patrons, there sat a man who didn't just look the part of success, he lived it. Dr. Marcus Williams, a well-respected black physician, was enjoying dinner after a long day at work. His presence was understated but commanding. He wore a tailored suit, the soft glint of his stethoscope peeking from his pocket. He exuded the quiet confidence of someone who had dedicated years to saving lives. Little did anyone know, this was about to be a night Dr. Williams would never forget, and not for any reason he could have imagined. As Marcus sipped his drink, a sudden shift in the air made him look up. In walked two police officers, their stern faces scanning the room, and their eyes quickly landing on him. Without any hesitation, they walked straight to his table. The restaurant, which had been buzzing with casual chatter, fell into an eerie silence. It wasn't every day that you saw the police approach someone with such intensity in the middle of a restaurant, especially not someone like Marcus, an esteemed doctor, whose very presence demanded respect. "Sir, we need to talk to you," one of the officers said, their voices cold and firm. Marcus, taken aback, looked around the room, feeling the eyes of every diner boring into him. His heart began to race. What was this about? He had done nothing wrong, and there was no way they could have mistaken him for someone else. He was well known in the community, both for his medical work and his calm demeanor. "Is there a problem, officers?" Marcus asked, his voice steady despite the tension creeping up his spine. "We've had a report of suspicious activity, and we need you to come with us," the officer replied, offering no further explanation. The tone left no room for negotiation. Marcus, still composed, stood up slowly, towering over the officers. He had always believed in letting his actions speak louder than words. His reputation, his achievements, his integrity, these were the things that mattered, not appearances. Yet, in that moment, none of that seemed to matter. The color of his skin was the only thing they saw. But what happened next sent a shockwave through the room. As the officers moved to take Marcus outside, someone else stepped forward, a man none of them had noticed until now. He was younger, but there was something strikingly familiar about him. It was Marcus's brother, Chris. No one knew much about Chris. Unlike his older brother, he had always kept a low profile, living a life far removed from the spotlight. But there was something in the way he carried himself that demanded attention now. Chris had a story, one that would leave the officers and everyone in the restaurant speechless. What was it about Chris that made even the officers pause? Why had they come for Marcus in the first place? And what truth would be revealed that would change everything in the blink of an eye? As Marcus stood there, surrounded by police and judgmental eyes, his mind raced through 1,000 questions. But it was Chris, the brother who had stayed in the shadows for so long, who would hold the key to the mystery that was about to unfold. Stay tuned to find out what happens next. Marcus stood frozen for a moment, the tension in the air thickening. All eyes were on him, on Chris, and on the officers who had come in so unexpectedly. The room, once filled with the quiet hum of conversation, now felt heavy with silence. His mind swirled with confusion. Why were they here? What had Chris been up to? Chris stepped forward, his eyes locking with Marcus's for a brief moment. There was a silent exchange between the two brothers, an unspoken understanding that something deeper was happening here. Marcus knew his brother had always been the more reserved one, keeping his personal life and struggles to himself. He had drifted away from the family over the years, not out of resentment, but out of a need for space, for freedom. Marcus had respected that, though he'd often worried about what path Chris had chosen. The officers, sensing the shift in attention to Chris, stood their ground but seemed uncertain. Chris was calm, too calm almost. His expression was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes that told Marcus this wasn't just about some random misunderstanding. There was more to this than met the eye. "Officers," Chris began, his voice steady but with an edge that hinted at the gravity of the situation. "I think you've got the wrong man." One of the officers, a middle-aged man with graying hair and a hardened face, narrowed his eyes. "And who are you?" he asked sharply. "I'm his brother," Chris said simply, glancing back at Marcus. "And if you're here because of something that happened, I can tell you it's me you're looking for." A murmur rippled through the restaurant, the tension in the room shifting again. Marcus felt his stomach drop. What was Chris talking about? What had he done? His mind raced through the possibilities, trying to piece together what could possibly have led to this moment. He had always assumed that Chris was leading a quiet, if somewhat distant, life. But now, the weight of his brother's words suggested something much darker was at play. The officer's gaze flicked between Marcus and Chris, clearly taken aback by this turn of events. "You're saying it's you. What exactly do you mean by that?" the officer asked, his tone skeptical. Chris hesitated, glancing around the restaurant before speaking again. "I'm saying you've been misled. Whatever you think Marcus did, he didn't. If you're here because of anything suspicious, it's because of me. I'll explain everything, but not here." The officer's partner, a younger man who had remained silent until now, finally spoke up. "You realize what you're saying, right? You're admitting to something that we haven't even accused you of yet." Chris nodded, his face still calm. "I do. But you'll understand soon enough." He turned to Marcus again, his eyes softening for a moment. "Marcus, you don't deserve this. You've never deserved any of it." Marcus, still in shock, took a step forward, his voice low and urgent. "Chris, what are you talking about? What's going on?" Chris didn't respond right away, but there was a sadness in his eyes that Marcus hadn't seen before. It was as if years of burden were finally bubbling to the surface. Chris had always been the more troubled of the two, though he'd kept most of his struggles hidden. While Marcus had pursued a successful career in medicine, Chris had wandered through life, never quite finding his place. They hadn't spoken as often as Marcus would have liked in recent years, but now, standing here in this restaurant with police at their side, it was clear Chris had been carrying a heavy secret. "Just trust me," Chris said quietly, his voice filled with an emotion that Marcus couldn't quite place. "I'll explain everything. But not here, not in front of all these people." The officers exchanged glances, clearly unsure how to proceed. One of them took a step closer to Chris, pulling out a notepad. "Let's take this outside. We'll talk more there." Chris nodded and turned to follow them, but Marcus couldn't let him go just like that. He grabbed Chris's arm, his grip firm but desperate. "Chris, please. Tell me what's happening. Don't leave me in the dark." Chris looked down at Marcus's hand on his arm, then back up into his brother's eyes. There was a long pause before he finally spoke. "I've been involved in things, Marcus. Things you wouldn't understand. It's complicated. I didn't want to drag you into it, but now, it's too late." Marcus's heart sank. He felt the weight of Chris's words, like a blow to his chest. What kind of trouble had his brother gotten into? And how had it led to this moment, with police at their heels and accusations hanging in the air? Before Marcus could ask more, the officers began moving toward the door, with Chris following them quietly. Marcus watched helplessly, his mind spinning. This was all so surreal. One moment he had been enjoying a peaceful dinner, and the next, his brother was confessing to something that threatened to unravel their lives. As the door closed behind Chris and the officers, the restaurant slowly returned to its normal rhythm, but nothing felt the same. Marcus sat back down at the table, his thoughts racing. He knew he couldn't just let this go. Whatever Chris had gotten himself into, Marcus was determined to get to the bottom of it. He had spent his whole life protecting his brother, and he wasn't about to stop now. The night was far from over, and the truth, whatever it was, had only begun to surface. Marcus had a sinking feeling that this was just the beginning of a much larger and darker story, one that would challenge everything he thought he knew about his brother, and maybe even himself. Marcus sat in stunned silence at the table, his mind reeling. The sounds of the restaurant, the clinking of silverware, murmured conversations felt distant, like a fog had settled over everything. His brother Chris had just been taken outside by the police, confessing to something Marcus couldn't yet comprehend. There was so much left unsaid, and Marcus's gut told him that this was only the tip of the iceberg. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. This wasn't just a simple misunderstanding or an unfortunate mix-up. The way Chris had looked at him, the sadness in his eyes, there was more to this than Marcus could imagine. And whatever it was, it had now pulled Marcus into its orbit. He stood up abruptly, leaving his half-eaten meal behind. Without thinking, he pushed his way through the restaurant toward the door, ignoring the curious glances from the other diners. As he stepped outside, the cool night air hit him, but it did nothing to clear the confusion swirling in his mind. He scanned the parking lot, his eyes landing on Chris and the two officers standing by a squad car, deep in conversation. Marcus hesitated, torn between staying back and rushing over. He had never seen his brother like this before, so secretive, so heavy with something unspoken. What had Chris gotten involved in that was so serious? And why had he tried to shield Marcus from it for so long? As Marcus debated what to do, one of the officers suddenly turned and began walking toward him. It was the younger one, the one who had spoken up in the restaurant. His face was tense, but calm as he approached Marcus. "Dr. Williams," the officer said, stopping just a few feet away. "We need to talk." Marcus's heart thudded in his chest. He hadn't done anything wrong, but the gravity of the situation made him feel like he was somehow on trial. "What's going on?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "Why are you taking Chris? What did he do?" The officer hesitated, glancing over his shoulder at Chris, who was leaning against the squad car, staring at the ground. "We're still piecing it together ourselves," the officer admitted, his voice lowering. "But it's not just about your brother. There's more going on here." Before Marcus could respond, the officer leaned in slightly, his voice barely above a whisper. "This isn't just about some minor crime or a misunderstanding. Your brother's involved in something bigger, something dangerous. We're talking about organized crime, potentially involving people much higher up than either of us can imagine." Marcus's breath caught in his throat. Organized crime? Chris? It didn't make sense. His brother had always been a bit of a loner, yes, but involved in something like that. It was hard to reconcile the image of the quiet, distant Chris with the world the officer was describing. The officer nodded grimly. "He's been on our radar for a while now, though we didn't know his full connection until tonight. That's why we approached you initially. We thought there might be more to it. But now it's clear. He's the one we need to talk to." Marcus felt the ground shift beneath him. He had always been the one in the family who had followed the rules, built a respectable career, and kept his life on track. Chris had always been the wild card, but Marcus had never imagined he'd be involved in something this serious. The officer's expression softened slightly. "Look, I'm not saying he's beyond help, but whatever he's gotten himself into, it's deep. And if you want to help him, you're going to need to know the truth." Marcus's head swirled with questions. He looked past the officer, his eyes locking on Chris once more. His brother still hadn't moved, his posture slumped, as if the weight of the world rested on his shoulders. Marcus knew without a doubt that this was the moment everything changed. Chris wasn't just in trouble, he was in way over his head. And whatever the officer was hinting at, it wasn't something that would be easily fixed. Before Marcus could gather his thoughts, the second officer, the older one, called out from the car. "We've got to go." The younger officer nodded at Marcus before heading back to the squad car, where Chris was now being placed in the back seat. Marcus stood there, his body tense, as the car doors slammed shut. He couldn't just let them drive away, not without getting answers. Without thinking, he rushed forward, his voice cracking with urgency. "Wait," Marcus called, his heart pounding. The officers paused, their eyes on him. "Let me talk to him. Just for a minute, please." The older officer seemed hesitant, but after a moment, he gave a brief nod. "Make it quick." Marcus hurried to the side of the car where Chris was sitting. The window rolled down slightly. Chris looked up, his eyes meeting Marcus's for what felt like the first time in years. There was something haunting in his gaze, regret, maybe even fear. Marcus swallowed hard, his voice breaking. "Chris," Marcus whispered, leaning down. "What's going on? Why didn't you tell me?" Chris sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I didn't want you involved, Marcus. This life I've been living, it's not something I'm proud of. I tried to handle it on my own, but it spiraled out of control." Marcus shook his head, his frustration boiling over. "You should have told me. I could have helped you. Whatever you've gotten into, we can fix it. But you have to let me in." Chris's eyes filled with a sadness Marcus had never seen before. "It's too late, Marcus. There are people involved, people who won't let me walk away that easily. I tried to keep you out of it, but now you're in danger too." Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. "What do you mean I'm in danger?" Chris glanced at the officers, then leaned in closer, his voice barely audible. "They know about you, Marcus. They know you're my brother. If they think you're a threat, they'll come after you. You need to stay out of this." Marcus's mind raced. Who were they? What had Chris gotten himself involved with? And how could he protect himself and his brother from something he barely understood? Before Marcus could ask more, the older officer gestured for them to wrap it up. Chris gave Marcus one last, pleading look. "Just stay safe, okay?" Chris whispered before the door closed, sealing him inside the car. As the squad car pulled away, Marcus stood frozen, watching the red taillights fade into the night. The realization hit him hard. This wasn't just about Chris anymore. Whoever these people were, whatever Chris had been involved in, Marcus was now caught in the crossfire. The stakes had just gotten a lot higher, and Marcus knew he was only beginning to scratch the surface of the truth. Marcus stood frozen on the sidewalk, long after the squad car had disappeared from view, his mind spinning. The weight of Chris's final words echoed in his head. "They know about you." Whoever these people were, whoever had dragged his brother into this, they weren't just coming for Chris. They might come for him too. Marcus had always been the one to fix things, to protect his family. But now he felt powerless, as if he was sinking into a situation too deep to climb out of. Over the next few days, Marcus couldn't focus. He went through the motions at the hospital, but his mind was always elsewhere. Every time his phone buzzed, he felt a jolt of fear, expecting bad news. Chris was still in custody, but the police had said little about what was happening with the investigation. And the more Marcus thought about it, the more questions he had. What exactly had Chris done? And who were these people that his brother was so terrified of? Then, late one night, Marcus got a phone call. It was from an unknown number, and something about it felt off. He hesitated for a moment before answering, a sense of dread settling over him. "Hello?" he said, his voice tight. There was a brief pause, then a deep voice came through the line. "Dr. Marcus Williams." Marcus's heart raced. "Yes." "Who is this?" "That's not important," the voice replied, cold and calculated. "But I'm calling about your brother, Chris." Marcus's hand tightened around the phone. "What do you want?" The voice on the other end chuckled softly, but it wasn't a friendly sound. "It's simple, really. Your brother owes us. He's been trying to get out of a deal he made, and we can't let that happen. You see, once you're in for life." Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. "Who are you? What do you want with him?" The voice grew more serious. "It doesn't matter who I am. What matters is that your brother made promises he couldn't keep. And now, you're going to help make things right. If you don't, well, let's just say accidents happen, even to doctors. Marcus's breath caught in his throat. Are you threatening me? There was a long silence before the voice replied, I'm giving you a choice. You help us get what we need, and your brother stays safe. If not, both of you will pay the price. Marcus's heart pounded in his chest. Whoever these people were, they weren't playing games. He had no idea what kind of deal Chris had made, but it was clear that they expected Marcus to clean up the mess. But how? He was a doctor, not a criminal. How could he possibly fix this? The voice continued, We'll be in touch. Don't think about going to the police. They won't help you. And if you try to run, we'll find you. We always do. The call ended abruptly, leaving Marcus standing in the middle of his living room, his hands shaking. He stared at the phone in disbelief, the full weight of the situation crashing down on him. These people weren't bluffing. They were serious, and now they had dragged him into their world. A world of crime, threats, and danger, something Marcus had spent his entire life avoiding. In the days that followed, Marcus received several more cryptic calls, each one pushing him closer to a breaking point. The voice never gave specifics, but the threats were clear. And each time, Marcus felt the walls closing in a little more. He tried to visit Chris in jail, but his brother refused to see him, leaving Marcus even more isolated and confused. It was as if Chris was trying to protect him by keeping his distance, but it wasn't working. Finally, after nearly a week of sleepless nights and mounting anxiety, Marcus received another call. This time, the voice gave him a location, a remote warehouse on the edge of town. Be there tonight, the voice said. Alone. Marcus knew he couldn't ignore it. He had to face this head-on, even if it terrified him. As night fell, he drove to the warehouse, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. The streets grew darker and more deserted the closer he got, and his stomach churned with dread. When he arrived, the warehouse was eerily quiet, its windows dark. He parked the car and stepped out, his heart pounding in his chest. Every instinct told him to turn back, to run. But he couldn't leave Chris to face this alone. As Marcus approached the entrance, a figure stepped out of the shadows. It was Chris. His brother's face was pale, his eyes sunken with exhaustion and fear. But there was something else in his expression, a kind of resignation that Marcus didn't like. Chris, Marcus said, rushing forward. What's going on? Why are we here? Chris glanced around nervously before speaking. I tried to keep you out of this, Marcus. I really did. But it's too late now. They think you can help them, that you have access to something they need. Marcus frowned. What do you mean? I'm a doctor, Chris. What could I possibly have that they want? Chris's face twisted with guilt. It's not about you, Marcus. It's about me. I made a deal with these people, and I couldn't hold up my end. They're using you as leverage to get to me. They think you'll do whatever they ask to keep me safe. Marcus shook his head, frustration bubbling up inside him. But what do they want? What do they expect me to do? Chris's eyes filled with sorrow as he looked at Marcus. It's not about what they want you to do, Marcus. It's about what they want me to do. He took a deep breath, as if preparing himself for what came next. They've been using me to launder money. I didn't realize how deep it went until it was too late. And now they're asking me to do something worse, something I can't do. Marcus's stomach dropped. What are you talking about? Chris looked away, his voice barely a whisper. They want me to get rid of someone. A rival. And if I don't, they'll come after you. Marcus felt the world tilt on its axis. No, he said, his voice shaking. You can't do that. We'll go to the police. We'll figure something out. But Chris shook his head. It's too late for that, Marcus. They're watching us right now. If I don't go through with it, they'll kill you. I can't let that happen. In that moment, Marcus realized the full weight of the situation. This wasn't just about Chris anymore, it was about both of them. And no matter what choice they made, someone was going to pay the price. But then, in a final twist that Marcus could never have anticipated, the door to the warehouse burst open. Several officers rushed in, their guns drawn. The very police force that Chris had feared was now their salvation. It turned out that one of the officers investigating Chris had been working undercover, and they had been tracking the crime ring for months. The calls, the threats, everything had been monitored. As the officers moved in to arrest the key players in the organization, Marcus stood frozen, his mind struggling to process the sudden turn of events. Chris, still shaken, looked at Marcus with relief and guilt all mixed together. "It's over," Chris whispered. But Marcus knew, in his heart, that this was just the beginning of healing from everything that had happened. The nightmare had ended, but the scars it left behind would take time to fade. As the police swarmed the warehouse, Marcus stood in the middle of the chaos, struggling to comprehend how quickly everything had shifted. His heart was still pounding, his body tense from the fear that had gripped him just moments before. Chris stood beside him, looking just as overwhelmed, his face pale and lined with exhaustion. The reality of what had just happened hadn't fully sunk in yet, and both brothers remained frozen, watching as the officers moved in, arresting the men who had controlled Chris's life for so long. One of the detectives, the younger officer Marcus had spoken to at the restaurant, approached them. He had a calm but firm expression on his face, and for the first time, Marcus felt a sense of relief. The danger, at least for now, seemed to be over. "You're safe now," the officer said, his voice steady but kind. "We've been tracking this group for a while. Your brother's involvement wasn't as deep as they wanted you to believe. He was being manipulated." Marcus let out a long breath, relief flooding through him. Chris, too, seemed to deflate, as though the weight of the world had finally been lifted from his shoulders. But even as the immediate danger passed, Marcus knew that the journey ahead wouldn't be easy. Chris had been involved in something dark, something that would take time to recover from, both emotionally and legally. And Marcus, though he hadn't been directly involved, had been dragged into the chaos too. The scars from this experience would take time to heal. The officer gestured for them to follow him, and Marcus and Chris were led outside. The night air was cool, a stark contrast to the tense heat that had filled the warehouse. As they stepped out into the open, Marcus looked up at the sky, taking in the fresh air for what felt like the first time in days. The stars above seemed distant and cold, but they were there, constant and unchanging, a reminder that life would go on even after all of this. Chris was quiet as they walked, his head down, lost in thought. Marcus knew his brother was struggling with more than just the events of the night. There were deeper wounds, old guilt and shame, that Chris had carried for years. And now that the immediate danger had passed, Marcus realized that this might be their chance to finally confront those demons. They were taken to the police station, where Chris was questioned further. Marcus sat in the waiting room, his mind racing with everything that had happened. The fear, the tension, the uncertainty, it had all been so overwhelming. But now in the aftermath, there was space to reflect. He thought about his relationship with Chris, about the distance that had grown between them over the years. They had once been so close, but life had pulled them in different directions, and the secrets Chris had kept had only widened that gap. As the hours passed, Marcus replayed the events of the last few days in his mind. The initial confrontation with the police at the restaurant, Chris's confession, the cryptic phone calls from the mysterious figures threatening them, it had all felt like a nightmare. But now that it was over, Marcus realized just how much he didn't know about his brother's life. Chris had been living in the shadows for so long, hiding his struggles, his mistakes. And now that everything had come to light, Marcus knew that they couldn't go back to the way things were before. When Chris finally emerged from the interrogation room, he looked exhausted but relieved. The officers had decided to release him, at least for the time being, while they continued their investigation into the larger criminal organization. Chris wasn't completely off the hook, but it was clear that he had been more of a pawn in the scheme than a willing participant. The authorities seemed to understand that Chris had been coerced into his involvement, and for now, he was free to go. As they left the police station, the two brothers walked in silence for a while. The streets were quiet, the city still asleep, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Marcus and Chris were alone together, with no one else watching or threatening them. Marcus glanced over at his brother, noticing the way Chris's shoulders slumped, the way his eyes were filled with regret. "Chris," Marcus said softly, breaking the silence, "you don't have to do this alone anymore. Whatever it is you've been dealing with, you can talk to me. I'm your brother." Chris stopped walking, turning to face Marcus. There was a vulnerability in his eyes that Marcus hadn't seen in years. "I didn't want you to know, Marcus. I didn't want you to see how far I'd fallen. You've always been the one who had it all together. I didn't want to drag you down with me." Marcus shook his head, feeling a surge of emotion. "You're my brother, Chris. I don't care about any of that. What matters is that we're in this together now. We can figure it out, one step at a time." For the first time in what felt like ages, Chris smiled, a small, tentative smile, but a real one. "Thanks, Marcus," he said quietly. "I didn't realize how much I needed to hear that." They continued walking, the weight of the night slowly lifting as they made their way back to Marcus's car. The events of the past few days had brought them closer in a way that years of distance hadn't. And while there were still challenges ahead, Marcus knew that they would face them together. In the weeks that followed, Chris began the slow process of untangling himself from the mess he had been pulled into. He cooperated with the authorities, providing information that helped dismantle the criminal organization he had been involved with. It wasn't an easy road. There were moments of doubt, of fear, of guilt, but with Marcus by his side, Chris found the strength to keep moving forward. Marcus, too, found himself reflecting on everything that had happened. He had always prided himself on being the responsible one, the one who had it all figured out. But this experience had taught him that life wasn't so simple, that everyone had their own battles to fight, even those closest to him. It had reminded him of the importance of family, of sticking together through the darkest times. As the months passed, Marcus and Chris rebuilt their relationship, slowly but surely. They spent more time together, talking openly about their lives, their struggles, their hopes for the future. It wasn't always easy. There were still moments of tension, of old wounds reopening, but they were committed to healing, to moving forward together. One evening, as they sat on Marcus's porch, watching the sunset, Chris turned to his brother with a look of quiet gratitude. "I never thanked you," Chris said, his voice soft, "for not giving up on me, for being there when I needed you the most." Marcus smiled, placing a hand on Chris's shoulder. "You don't have to thank me, Chris. We're brothers. That's what family is for." Chris nodded, his eyes reflecting the fading light of the sun. "I know. But still, I'm grateful." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the world in a warm golden glow, Marcus felt a sense of peace that had eluded him for so long. The chaos of the past was behind them now, and while there were still challenges ahead, they faced them together as brothers. The story of Marcus and Chris was one of redemption, of second chances, of the unbreakable bond between family. And as they sat together in the fading light, both of them knew that, no matter what the future held, they would face it side by side. The lessons of the past few months stayed with them: the importance of honesty, of trust, of not trying to handle everything alone. Marcus had learned that even the strongest people needed help sometimes, and Chris had learned that asking for help wasn't a sign of weakness, but of strength. In the end, they had come out stronger, their bond deeper than ever before. And though the road ahead was still uncertain, one thing was clear: they would face it together.